I rise today as the New South Wales Greens spokesperson on democracy to introduce the Crimes and Roads Legislation Amendment Obstruction Offences Repeals Bill 2025. Yeah. I'd like to start by acknowledging the incredible members of the community who have joined us here today, who care deeply about the right to protest and understand just how important it is for our democracy. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you. That was unexpected. New South Wales has a proud history of protest movements that have shaped our society, from the first Mardi Gras to the renowned green bans protecting green space, public housing and heritage across Sydney. Much of what we love about living here has been hard won through protest movements, but the fundamental right to protest is under attack. Over the last 20 years, New South Wales has passed more anti-protest laws than any other Australian jurisdiction. This includes 2 since November last year, making it an offence to protest near a railway or a place of worship, along with the criminalisation in 2022 of protests on roads and around major facilities. This bill seeks to repeal these recent changes by amending both the Roads Act and the Crimes Act. In short, Schedule 1 of this bill amends the Roads Act 1993 to abolish the offence for a person to enter, remain on, climb, jump from or otherwise trespass on a major road. Schedule 3, 1 and 2 amend the Crimes Act 1900 to abolish the offence for a person to enter, remain on or near, climb, jump from or otherwise trespass on or block an entry to any part of a major facility. Schedule 3.3 proposes to repeal Part 4AF, abolishing the offence inserted by the Crimes Amendment Places of Worship Act 2025, which created new offences for protests in or near places of worship. Schedule 5 amends the Law Enforcement Power and Responsibilities Act 2002 to remove a police officer's power to issue move-on directions in relation to a protest occurring in or near a place of worship. Schedules 2 and 4 make consequential amendments to the respective acts. It feels incredibly timely to be standing here today to second read the bill to repeal these draconian anti-protest laws, particularly in light of the troubling rhetoric coming from both the Premier and the opposition in response to the March for Humanity on Sunday. Last weekend, we saw hundreds of thousands of people turn up to protest against the bombing and starvation of innocent civilians by the Israeli government in Gaza. People came together to peacefully use their collective voices to tell the government that they want action, not words. Protesters know that governments around the world, including the Australian government, can and should do more and are calling for sanctions on Israel and an end to the two-way arms trade. They want peace and an end to the killing of innocent men, women and children. People turned up in torrential rain with their kids, in their wheelchairs, with their walking sticks, in their hundreds of thousands to march over the Sydney Harbour Bridge to send a message not just to the people of Sydney, but around the world, that enough is enough and these atrocities must end. A peaceful protest of this scale should be cause for all elected representatives to stop and think about the message people are trying to tell us. After almost 2 years of near weekly protests, people came together at an enormous scale to share their horror, their frustration and their incredible sadness at what is taking place, but they also brought their hope for change, a hope for real action from their elected leaders. This is the power of mass protest movements. It unites people and gives us a shared voice. That's why it has been so incredibly disappointing this week to see both Premier Minns and the Leader of the Opposition instead suggest that Sunday's march set a dangerous precedent. Yesterday, we saw the opposition try and fail to rush through another suite of anti-protest laws that would introduce a user-pays system for policing of protests and would raise additional barriers to organise authorised protests of the scale we saw on Sunday.
Shame.
Likewise, the Premier has doubled down on his anti-protest rhetoric in the media, focusing on hypothetical claims of a potentially perilous situation rather than acknowledging the message that the organisers and the attendees were sending. This came after earlier comments from the Premier that he indicated right from the start that he did not want to see this protest take place. He intervened and pushed New South Wales Police to challenge the Form 1 in court. The comments from the Premier are alarmingly similar to those made online by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who has suggested it is politicians who should be able to decide whether or not protests like this should be allowed to proceed.
Shame.
Views like this are oppressive and they are anti-democratic, and it shows that we are on a slippery slope towards authoritarianism. The right to protest is not a privilege to be granted or denied by politicians or police. It is a fundamental democratic right that must be protected. It is a cornerstone of a mature democracy. While we saw a good outcome last week with the attempts to block the authorisation for the March for Humanity being defeated in the Supreme Court, the level of opposition to the protest from both New South Wales Labor and the opposition indicates just how hostile an environment we have here in New South Wales when it comes to protest. This hasn't happened by accident. We've reached this point after years of consecutive governments with bipartisan support introducing increasingly oppressive laws to crack down on the right to protest and to undermine our democracy. The most recent changes sought to criminalise peaceful protest and make it harder for people to assemble in public places, including on roads and in declared major facilities, including train stations, that have typically been associated with peaceful protests and gatherings. People found guilty under these anti-protest laws are liable for up to 2 years in prison or a fine of $22,000. This year, New South Wales Labor also rushed through laws to make it harder to protest in or near places of worship, with police granted sweeping powers to move on protesters for vague and poorly defined reasons. The chilling effect of these heavy-handed and undemocratic laws cannot be understated. Right from the beginning, unions New South Wales, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, the Australian Services Union, the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union, the Maritime Union of Australia, the CFMEU and the National Tertiary Education Union sounded the alarm on these dangerous anti-protest laws. More than 230 civil society and human rights groups vocally opposed their introduction. To demonstrate the widespread concerns of the experts and relevant stakeholders in this space, I'll share with you a small sample of the warnings given on these draconian laws. The Human Rights Law Centre has said that these laws are anti-democratic, disproportionate and violate international human rights law. Other organisations, including the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, have warned that these laws significantly infringe people's right to freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and freedom of political communication. Similarly, the EDO, the Environmental Defenders Office Legal Strategy Director, argued that such changes pose a very significant risk, not just to those individuals charged, but also to our democratic process and our shared climate. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Oriana, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances and Human Rights, included warnings on the negative impact of anti-protest laws in Australia. His interim report said, draconian restrictions on the right to peaceful protest in several states are also very troubling. Peaceful protests are a legitimate exercise of the right to freedom of assembly, and they enable citizens to mobilise their concerns and make them visible to public authorities. In December 2023, we saw some of these objections upheld by the New South Wales Supreme Court. In the case of Cavelda versus the State of New South Wales, the Supreme Court ruled that sections 214A1C and 214A1D of the Crimes Act were invalid for impermissibly burdening the Commonwealth Constitution's implied freedom of political communication. Despite consulting with the community on these laws earlier in 2024, the government has failed to remove the unconstitutional provisions from the Crimes Act. Furthermore, other laws that infringe the right to protest remain in force, with the government making no attempt to act on these concerns raised by human rights experts and advocacy groups. In fact, they've added a suite of new laws this year to criminalise peaceful protests in or near places of worship, at train stations, metro stations and major facilities, all of which have been heavily criticised by civil society groups and legal experts. In July this year, a submission was made on behalf of the NGO Coalition to Australia's 4th Universal Periodic Review, which represents input from over 100 Australian NGOs. And this submission paints a bleak picture for the Australian human rights and for our democracy. The submission highlights the efforts to undermine democratic freedom of rights regarding protests, and it refers not only to the legislative attempts to stifle protests, but also to alarming incidents of police misusing crowd control weapons and using dangerous tactics at protests that have resulted in serious harm to protesters. This submission is made by experts in the field, sounding the alarm on the erosion of our democracy and the very real threat to safety for community members still asserting their right to protest. And let's be clear, the risk to safety for protesters is very real. We all are aware, and it would be remiss of me not to mention the deeply concerning response to the peaceful protest held in Belmore earlier this year, where it resulted in a significant injury to Hannah Thomas, a lawyer and former Greens candidate for Grayndler. It has been alleged that a member of the New South Wales Police punched Ms Thomas in the face when she sought to clarify an ambiguous move on direction, and as a result of the injury she sustained, Ms Thomas may lose her vision in one eye. I, along with many others in our community, are horrified to hear accounts like these from people who are peacefully protesting and engaging in what should be considered a fundamental human right. This is the impact on the ground when people in the highest levels of government, like the Premier, demonise peaceful protesters and embolden heavy-handed policing. These actions are aimed to silence dissent and to discourage people from protesting. Our community has continued to feel the chilling effects of these anti-protest laws. In November 2023, over 100 peaceful climate protesters were arrested, and 23 of them were charged simply for standing up against climate injustice in Newcastle Harbour. Those convicted have faced steep fines under the new laws, and they've also faced oppressive bail conditions, including requirements to report to the police up to 3 times a week, handing over their phones, not associating with certain people and organisations in the climate movement, and not attending unlawful protests. These are the types of conditions we should be reserving for organised criminal gangs, not people who are using their voices to advocate for the environment. The rights eroded by constant attacks on peaceful protest in New South Wales have their roots in international human rights law. The right to peaceful assembly and association is found under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is also found under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Australia is a signatory to. The ICCPR provides for the rights of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and the freedom of association. The High Court has also ruled that under our federal constitution we have an implied right to freedom of political communication. In making this determination, the High Court suggested that the free exchange of political communications is fundamental to the operations of the representative and accountable government established under the Constitution. While these rights are not absolute, there is a high threshold that must be met to curtail these basic freedoms that are enshrined in international human rights law. For example, to restrict the right to peaceful assembly, the ICCPR requires that any attempts to curtail the right are necessary and proportionate, and that they are an appropriate response to a pressing social need. Similarly, to curtail rights under our Constitution, the law needs to be reasonably appropriate and adapted. Now, the comments that I shared earlier from experts and advocates in this field indicate that the anti-protest laws we are dealing with here are not reasonable, necessary, and they are certainly not proportionate. They were a knee-jerk response to talkback radio shock jocks complaining about protesting causing traffic delays. When introducing these undemocratic laws, former Attorney General Mark Speakman spoke about the need to deter actions that close or obstruct roads and bridges that cause traffic diversions and economic loss. This is the same troubling language being rolled out again this week in response to the March for Humanity. We cannot allow such a low threshold to stand when it comes to casting aside fundamental human rights. This was a point made by Justice Riggs in her judgment on the Harbour Bridge March just last week. Simply causing disruption or inconvenience is not sufficient grounds in and of itself to restrict the right to protest. The rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of political communication cannot be sacrificed for the sake of short-term economics or to avoid being temporarily inconvenienced on your drive to work. These anti-protest laws are a massive overreach and demonstrate a real threat to our democracy. Democracy, as we know it, is not just about the ability to vote. True democracy comes when people can voice their disagreement with the decisions of government without fear of being criminalised, targeted by heavy-handed police surveillance, subjected to hefty fines, or imprisoned. New South Wales already has some of the most restrictive anti-protest laws in the country. In their most recent report, Protest in Peril, Our Shrinking Democracy, the Human Rights Law Centre highlighted that New South Wales has more anti-protest laws than anywhere else in Australia, and the introduction of new anti-protest laws in this state has been increasing at an alarming rate. We are on a dangerous slide to authoritarianism. If we don't stand up today, these undemocratic laws that stifle our most fundamental rights, the right to speak, to gather, to dissent, will continue to erode our democracy. We must repeal them for the sake of our future and the generations to come. At the end of the day, people in our community should have the confidence to engage in peaceful protests, calling for action on climate change or calling for an end to war. Teachers and nurses should be able to join colleagues to rally on the street calling for fairer pay and conditions. Sometimes peaceful protests may be disruptive. They might cause traffic congestion. They might cause train delays, but that is part of what it means to live in a democratic country. In fact, much of what we now take for granted was hard won by protesters in years gone by. In my own electorate of Balmain, things would have looked vastly different without seeing strong local activism. Greens bans help protect much needed public housing that still stands in Glebe, as well as treasured inner west local icons, including the heritage listed Callan Park, Ballast Point Park and Clontarf Cottage. Looking at social movements in Australia more broadly, we know that protests played a huge role in shifting the government policy on the Vietnam War and on the approach to apartheid South Africa. Protest movements helped win the right to vote for women and for First Nations people. Protest actions from the union movement secured weekends, public holidays and an 8-hour working day. The first Mardi Gras protest helped put LGBTQIA+ rights on the agenda. These wins are significant, and it is all thanks to our robust democracy and the right to protest. But there is still so much more work to be done. And I ask everyone in this place to remember this when you think about what's at stake if we allow our right to protest to be eroded under these democratic laws. Today we see continued violence in the Middle East with the ongoing starvation and bombing of innocent civilians in Palestine. People have a right to peaceful protest, to hold our decision makers to account, and to say that they don't support public money being used to fund war crimes overseas. They don't want to see parts manufactured in Australia being used to help bomb refugee camps, schools and hospitals. Our community has every right to stand up and call for peace, just as they did during the Vietnam War and during the apartheid regime in South Africa. On other fronts, we continue to deal with the fallout from runaway climate change fueled by successive governments that put the profits of the coal and gas lobby ahead of the interests of people and our environment. People have the right to express their frustration and their opposition to these decisions, but instead, Australia has the appalling record of leading the world in arresting climate and environmental protesters. I mean, let's think about that for a moment. Across the world, we have the record of arresting climate and environment protesters. That is absolutely shameful. The people of New South Wales have every right to demand more from their elected representatives, to take to the streets, to disrupt business as usual, to peacefully advocate for change in the same way that environmental activists of the past banded together to save the Franklin River. It's movements like this that have shaped our society and will continue to shape our future. If we truly value democracy and freedom of political communication, we cannot allow these draconian anti-protest laws to stand. We must ensure a healthy and mature democracy that engages with, respects and facilitates political expression outside of the ballot box. We must ensure that we have a society where people are not criminalised and imprisoned for expressing themselves in peaceful and non-violent ways. The ongoing attacks on the right to protest must stop, and these undemocratic laws should be repealed. And I just want to say again, the response that we've seen from the opposition and the Premier this week, demonising people for wanting to walk across the Harbour Bridge, to speak to the people in power and to try and let them know that they are not being represented, has been truly shocking. To see that their response is to try and limit protests to 3 times a year, to stop people completely from walking over the Harbour Bridge. We know the Harbour Bridge is a symbol across the world, and it was so important for us to get that message out broadly across the world on the weekend.
Yeah.
Now finally, Before I finish today, I'd like to take another moment to thank all of you who have joined us today in the gallery. Your support on the right to protest is so important, and it's only by standing together that we can stop these attacks on our democracy. Thank you also to the unions, the civil society organisations, including the Human Rights Law Centre, the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties and Rising Tide, who joined me this morning to talk about these laws, to the environmental organisations, peace activists, social justice fighters, so many more people who have consistently defended the right to protest here in New South Wales. The Greens stand alongside you. We need to keep the pressure on now more than ever. We will not stop until we see these terrible laws repealed in this state. And I stand alongside you, and I thank you again so much for being here to join, to show the government how much you care and how important this issue is. And I commend this bill to the House.
Here.
I thank the member. The time for consideration of general business. I call the member for Granville to move that this debate be now adjourned.